Something extraordinary has just happened in North America. Something so massive, so unexpected, and so strategically revealing that global investors are still trying to make sense of it. A financial giant that commands $242 billion in assets, one of the most conservative, long-horizon infrastructure investors on Earth, quietly turned its back on the United States and chose Canada as its new priority. Not next year, not eventually, right now. While Washington was busy issuing threats, tariffs, and ultimatums, Canada was quietly redrawing the economic map of the continent. And when the moment came for the world to decide where the real stability lay, where long-term prosperity could be trusted, global capital delivered its verdict with astonishing clarity. It chose Canada. But this isn't just a story about one Australian fund opening an office in Toronto. This is the story of a continental power shift, a slow-burning transformation that started when Mark Carney stepped into office with a plan no one believed in, and ended with one of the world's most cautious investment giants declaring Canada the future of North American infrastructure. And what follows will explain why this decision might mark the beginning of America's economic decline and the rise of a new Canadian era. On December 10, 2025, financial markets were shaken by a single announcement from Bay Street. IFM Investors, global powerhouse, steward of pension wealth, guardian of long-term stability, was opening its new Canadian headquarters in Toronto, not New York. Their Canadian director spoke with the calm of someone stating an obvious truth. Canada has a dynamic infrastructure landscape. What the government is doing supported our decision to make Canada a priority. For Washington, this wasn't a compliment. This was a warning. Because IFM doesn't chase hype. It doesn't gamble. It doesn't move fast unless the world around it is shifting in ways too large to ignore. And by choosing Canada now, under tariff threats, under uncertainty, under American pressure, they signaled something no American analyst wanted to admit. Canada's stability has eclipsed America's dominance. What appeared at first like a routine corporate expansion instantly became a geopolitical statement. America was no longer the automatic destination for capital, and the world's most patient investors had just demonstrated that the U.S. was no longer a safe assumption. But this moment was only the first fracture in a much deeper break. The seeds of this shift were planted months earlier, when Donald Trump doubled down on the one strategy he believes solves everything: threats. Tariffs on allies, ultimatums to partners, demands instead of diplomacy. He believed he could strong-arm Canada into compliance. Instead, he pushed global capital away from America. Investors hate chaos more than anything. They can tolerate risk, but not unpredictability. And when Trump weaponized the economy, he created an environment where companies, pension funds, and sovereign wealth institutions no longer saw the U.S. as a stable, long-term partner. Canada, meanwhile, moved in the opposite direction. Where Washington barked orders, Ottawa built alliances. Where Trump demanded concessions, Carney offered cooperation. Where America leaned into isolation, Canada leaned into integration. And as tensions grew, the global financial community quietly watched, comparing the two approaches. One model hinged on fear, the other on trust. And trust always wins, especially over decades. That's why IFM's move wasn't a surprise to anyone paying attention. It was the natural consequence of a United States that pushed even its closest allies into the arms of a more predictable partner. But investors weren't just responding to Trump's chaos. They were responding to something far more powerful. When Mark Carney stepped into office, he announced a goal that Wall Street dismissed instantly: $500 billion in private sector infrastructure investment within 5 years. The reaction was near universal. Impossible. Canada's too small. You can't do it without American buy-in. Foreign capital won't come without U.S. approval. Analysts saw limitations. Carney saw an opening. America's unpredictability created a market vacuum, a massive void for a country capable of offering the two things investors crave: stability and respect. Carney didn't compete with the United States. He bypassed it. He built roadmaps for investment that didn't require American intermediaries. He prioritized sectors where Canadian autonomy mattered most: energy, minerals, transportation, digital infrastructure, ports, climate-resilient power grids. And slowly, quietly, global institutions began to shift their gaze northward. Then came the proof Wall Street never expected: a $70 billion wave of commitments from sovereign wealth funds during Carney's UAE mission. Suddenly, the target no longer looked unrealistic. It looked conservative. Still, none of this compared to the message IFM delivered next. To understand the magnitude of IFM's choice, you must understand how they operate. They don't think in years. They think in decades. Their infrastructure investments, airports, ports, telecom networks, renewable grids, LNG systems, are designed to last 30, 40, even 50 years. A decision like opening new headquarters is not a bet on a moment. It's a bet on a country's future. And IFM's calculations were simple. Canada offers multi-decade predictability. America no longer does. Their Canadian portfolio already included $2.1 billion spread across key sectors: Vancouver's container terminals, Ontario's district energy systems, major urban infrastructure assets. But the Toronto office signals something much bigger. They're not maintaining investments, they're scaling them. And look at the sectors they explicitly targeted for expansion: renewable power and energy systems, LNG corridors, digital infrastructure and data hubs, transportation networks, social infrastructure. Every one of these aligns with Carney's strategy to reduce American leverage over Canada's economy. This wasn't coincidence. This was alignment. Strategic, deliberate, and intentional. But the ripple effects of this decision wouldn't stay in the markets for long. When a single giant moves, the market notices. When a pattern emerges, the world reacts. IFM's move was not isolated. It was part of a broader shift that U.S. media refused to acknowledge. European firms opening headquarters in Toronto instead of New York. Asian investors choosing Vancouver over Seattle. Global manufacturers relocating supply chains to Canada to avoid tariffs. American companies themselves scouting Canadian facilities to bypass Trump's policies. One decision looks like coincidence. 10 looks like realignment. Hundreds look like the beginning of a capital exodus. This is how superpowers decline, not in a single collapse, but in thousands of small choices made by global players seeking stability elsewhere. And each time an institution picks Canada over the US, the message grows louder. America is no longer the default. But what happened next made even the skeptics stop dismissing Canada's rise. When Carney traveled to the UAE, few expected anything major, but the result stunned financial watchers. $70 billion in direct investment commitments. Not loans, not conditional offers, actual long-term capital. And the sectors targeted? Critical minerals, clean energy, digital infrastructure, electric transportation corridors. That billion-dollar mineral processing investment was particularly telling. It signaled a new supply chain reality. Canada is directly connecting to Asia and Europe, cutting out American intermediaries entirely. For generations, the U.S. acted as the gatekeeper to North American investment. Carney simply removed the gate. The UAE wasn't alone. European sovereign funds followed. Asian institutions followed. And then IFM, a titan, made the most symbolic declaration of all by planting its long-term foothold in Toronto. This wasn't competition with America anymore. This was replacement. But the full meaning of this shift becomes clear only when you look at what Canada is becoming. Canada's strategy is no longer reactive. It's transformational. Carney is building what he calls infrastructure independence, a national system capable of thriving without American permission or participation. The sectors IFM is targeting are the backbone of this new identity. Ports that connect Canada directly to Asian trade, telecom systems not reliant on U.S. networks, renewable grids that bypass American energy markets, mineral refining independent of U.S. processing, data infrastructure located entirely on Canadian soil. In other words, Canada is detaching itself from America's economic gravity. This is not anti-American, it's evolutionary. And global investors have recognized something Washington ignored. A country that treats partnerships with respect will always outperform a country that treats alliances as leverage. Carney's model is attracting capital. Trump's model is driving it away. And IFM's decision marks the moment that divide became undeniable. But the real story isn't about the billions already committed. It's about the next 40 years. When a $242 billion institution, built on some of the most cautious pension money on earth, chooses Canada over the United States, it sends a message far louder than any political speech or economic forecast. Investors speak through action, not opinion. And IFM's decision is the clearest signal yet that the gravitational center of North American stability is shifting north. For decades, the U.S. didn't just dominate global investment, it defined it. If you wanted long-term security, you went to New York. If you needed scale, you went to American markets. If you wanted predictability, you trusted U.S. institutions. That cycle held for nearly a century. Until now. Because IFM's move isn't a temporary reaction to political drama. It's a structural readjustment. It reflects a belief that Canada, not the U.S., now offers the smoother regulatory landscape, the steadier policy environment, the cleaner investment path, and the long-term national strategy required to safeguard generational capital. Carney's model, cooperation, predictability, infrastructure sovereignty, aligns perfectly with how long-horizon investors think. Trump's model, pressure, unpredictability, economic threats, pushes that same capital away. What we are witnessing is not a single decision, but the accumulation of 1,000 quiet calculations made in boardrooms across the world. With IFM embedding its future in Toronto, Canada is no longer merely an alternative to America. It is becoming the primary hub for multi-decade capital in the Western Hemisphere, the new home for infrastructure investment, the new anchor for long-term planning, the new benchmark for political and economic stability. And while Washington watches this shift with growing unease, the truth is unavoidable. Canada is emerging as the continent's future, not because America has fallen, but because Canada has finally stepped into a role it was long prepared to claim. A new center of gravity has formed, and it's not where anyone expected. What happened with IFM Investors is more than a financial headline. It is a turning point, subtle enough that many will overlook it, yet powerful enough that the next decade of North American economics may be shaped by it. A $242 billion institution, built on decades of disciplined pension savings, does not shift its priorities lightly. When an investor of that size and reputation declares Canada its new strategic focus, the world pays attention, even if Washington pretends not to. For generations, the United States enjoyed an unchallenged position as the continent's economic anchor. It didn't need to fight for trust. It existed by default. But defaults only last as long as stability does, and America's volatility has rewritten the assumptions global capital once held. Investors no longer see the U.S. as the automatic safe harbor they once did. Instead, they see a country swayed by political unpredictability, tariff warfare, and an approach to alliances that treats cooperation as weakness. Canada, meanwhile, has stepped into the vacuum with a clarity no one anticipated. Mark Carney's strategy, mocked at first, has now proven itself as the blueprint for a modern, resilient economy. infrastructure independence, global partnerships, policy stability, respect for investment. These aren't slogans, they are the conditions capital requires to settle for decades. IFM's move is the verdict the markets have now delivered. Canada is where the long-term future feels certain. Canada is where decades of returns feel protected. Canada is where global capital can breathe without waiting for political shockwaves. So the real question is no longer why IFM chose Canada. The real question is how many others will follow, and how soon Americans will realize that the economic center of gravity they once controlled is slowly, quietly, and decisively shifting north.